In 1925, the Soviet government renamed the city of Tsaritsyn to Stalingrad, Stalin's city. The official reason was to commemorate Joseph Stalin's role in defending the city during the Russian Civil War in 1918. For decades, Soviet propaganda celebrated Stalin as the savior of Tsaritsyn, the man whose iron will held the line against the White armies when all seemed lost. But the actual events of 1918 tell a more complicated story. Stalin did participate in the defense of Tsaritsyn, but his role was primarily as a political commissar sent to secure grain supplies. His time there was marked less by military triumph than by insubordination, political conflict with other Bolshevik leaders, and the systematic execution of officers he deemed unreliable. The city's defense succeeded despite Stalin's interference, not because of it. This is the story of the Battle of Tsaritsyn, how a strategic city on the Volga was defended, how Stalin manipulated that defense into a personal legend, and how propaganda transformed messy reality into heroic myth.
To understand why Tsaritsyn mattered, we need to understand the desperate situation facing the Bolshevik regime in mid-1918. The Bolsheviks had seized power in Petrograd in October 1917, but their control remained tenuous. By spring 1918, they held the industrial centres of Moscow and Petrograd, but much of the country was slipping from their grasp. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed in March 1918, had ended Russia's participation in World War I, but at an enormous cost. The Bolsheviks surrendered vast territories, including Ukraine, the Baltic states and Poland, to German occupation. This territorial loss created immediate problems. The Ukraine had been Russia's breadbasket. Its grain fed the cities. Now it was under German control, and no grain flowed north. Similarly, Siberia, another major grain-producing region, was descending into civil war as anti-Bolshevik forces, including the Czech Legion, seized control of key areas. By May 1918, Moscow and Petrograd were starving. Workers received rations of perhaps 2 ounces of bread per day, barely enough to sustain life. The Bolshevik regime faced a stark choice: either find grain immediately or watch their urban support base literally starve to death. There was only one remaining source: the southeastern regions, particularly the North Caucasus. And the route from the North Caucasus to central Russia ran through a single city, Tsaritsyn. Tsaritsyn sat on the lower Volga River, roughly where modern Volgograd stands. It was an industrial city with ammunition factories, a rail hub connecting multiple regions, and a river port that controlled traffic on the Volga. Control Tsaritsyn and you controlled access to southern grain and Baku oil. Lose Tsaritsyn and Moscow and Petrograd would be cut off from their last remaining supply source. The situation around Tsaritsyn deteriorated rapidly. The Don Soviet Republic, a Bolshevik-controlled entity, collapsed. In its place emerged the Don Republic under Ataman Pyotr Krasnov, who commanded substantial Don Cossack forces and had German backing. Krasnov's objective was to expand Don Cossack control over surrounding territories, including Tsaritsyn. Lenin understood the stakes. In early June, he sent Stalin south with extraordinary powers to obtain grain by any means necessary. Stalin's official title was People's Commissar for Nationalities, but his mission to Tsaritsyn was explicitly about grain procurement. The defense of the city was secondary to getting grain trains moving north. Stalin arrived in Tsaritsyn on June 6, 1918, accompanied by a detachment of workers. What happened over the following 5 months would be transformed by Soviet propaganda into one of the Civil War's defining narratives, but the reality was considerably messier.
When Stalin arrived in Tsaritsyn, he found a city in chaos.
Local Bolshevik forces were disorganized, military units that had retreated from the Don and Donbass regions were scattered and demoralized. There was no unified command structure, and the task of organizing grain shipments north was complicated by the military threat from Krasnov's approaching Cossack forces. Stalin quickly exceeded his original mandate. Rather than focusing solely on grain procurement, he began involving himself in military matters. Together with Kliment Voroshilov, who commanded local Red forces, Stalin established the North Caucasus Military District to centralize control over Bolshevik forces in the region. This was a significant expansion of authority that Stalin had not been explicitly granted. But the real conflict emerged over a fundamental policy dispute within the Bolshevik leadership: the employment of military specialists. Leon Trotsky, as People's Commissar for Military Affairs, had been building the Red Army from the remnants of the old Imperial Russian Army. His strategy involved recruiting former Tsarist officers, men with professional military training and combat experience, to command Red Army units. These military specialists would be supervised by political commissars who would ensure their loyalty, but their military expertise was considered essential. Trotsky argued that the Red Army couldn't function effectively without professional military leadership. Stalin fundamentally disagreed with this approach. He viewed former Tsarist officers as inherently unreliable, potential traitors waiting for opportunities to sabotage Bolshevik operations or defect to the Whites. In Stalin's view, political reliability mattered more than military expertise. He preferred commanders who were ideologically committed Bolsheviks, even if they lacked formal military training. This wasn't purely theoretical disagreement. When Stalin examined the situation at Tsaritsyn, he concluded that military specialists appointed by Trotsky were incompetent at best, actively treacherous at worst. In telegrams to Lenin, Stalin complained bitterly about these shoemakers, his derisive term, who were, in his view, sleeping on the job or deliberately sabotaging operations. On July 10, 1918, Stalin wrote to Lenin describing how Trotsky had granted authority to various figures, including members of the French mission who deserved to be arrested. This reference to the French mission requires context. French forces had intervened in southern Russia supporting anti-Bolshevik elements. Stalin claimed that Trotsky was, through incompetence or worse, effectively collaborating with interventionists. Stalin's solution was direct. He would remove military specialists he deemed unreliable without waiting for authorization from Moscow. As he telegrammed Lenin, the interest of this work dictate this, and of course, not having a paper from Trotsky is not going to deter me. He proceeded to do exactly that. Stalin arrested General Andrei Snazarev, who had been appointed commander of the North Caucasus Military District, along with numerous other former Tsarist officers serving in the Red Army around Tsaritsyn. These men were imprisoned on barges on the Volga. Most of them were eventually executed, though Snazarev himself was freed on Trotsky's orders and reassigned elsewhere. Stalin also arrested artillery officers, administrative staff, and anyone whose loyalty he questioned. The scope of this purge was substantial. It gutted the command structure that had been laboriously assembled. From Stalin's perspective, this was necessary security. From Trotsky's perspective, it was sabotage of military operations driven by paranoia and political rivalry.
While Stalin and Trotsky feuded over command arrangements, actual combat operations were unfolding around Tsaritsyn. Krasnov's Don Cossacks launched their first serious assault on the city in July 1918. The Cossack forces numbered perhaps 30,000, 40,000 troops, though estimates vary. They were primarily cavalry, mobile, experienced fighters familiar with the terrain.
Against them, Voroshilov had assembled approximately 40,000 Red Army troops, many of them recently recruited workers and peasants with minimal training. The initial Cossack offensive made significant gains, pushing Bolshevik forces back toward the city itself. By late July and August, Tsaritsyn was under siege. Krasnov's strategy was to encircle the city, cut its supply lines, and force surrender through blockade and bombardment. The Bolshevik defense had certain advantages. Tsaritsyn's ammunition factories could supply defenders even when cut off from external sources. The Volga River provided access for bringing in supplies and reinforcements from the north, at least as long as the Reds maintained control of the waterway. And the city's fortifications, while not extensive, provided defensive positions that favoured the defenders. But the situation remained precarious throughout the summer. The siege tightened, and by September, the city was almost completely surrounded. The Red Forces' main advantage was artillery. They had more heavy guns than the Cossacks, which allowed them to maintain defensive fire even when outnumbered in other respects. At this point, the conflict between Stalin and the Central Military Command intensified. In late September 1918, the Red Army High Command reorganized the Southern Front, appointing former Tsarist General Pavel Sitin as overall commander. Sitin was exactly the sort of military specialist Stalin detested. When Sitin arrived in Tsaritsyn on September 29, expecting to take command, Stalin and Voroshilov refused to acknowledge his authority. A physical confrontation occurred at a meeting of the North Caucasus Military Council. Accounts describe it as a brawl, not just heated argument, but actual physical violence between Bolshevik leaders supposedly fighting on the same side. Against the explicit orders of the High Command, Voroshilov was kept in command of local forces. Trotsky and Yukhomzvatsiets, the Red Army commander-in-chief, demanded that Stalin be removed from his post and Voroshilov be brought before a military tribunal for insubordination. Stalin responded with his own telegrams to Lenin, complaining about Trotsky's incompetence and demanding that Trotsky be restrained. Lenin found himself mediating between two of his most important subordinates while the fate of a strategically critical city hung in the balance. This was not ideal civil war leadership. Ironically, the second siege was broken not through Stalin's intervention, but through an act of military insubordination that Stalin himself had encouraged. Dmitry Joba commanded the Steel Division, a 15,000-strong force that was part of the 11th Army operating in the North Caucasus. Joba was ordered to remain in the Caucasus, but Stalin convinced him to march to Stalin's relief against orders. On October 15, Joba's division struck Krasnov's besieging forces in a surprise attack, breaking the encirclement. This success had nothing to do with Stalin's military acumen. It was Joba's tactical competence and the Steel Division's fighting quality. But Stalin took credit, and the success temporarily validated his defiance of Central Command. By the end of October, the Cossacks were forced to withdraw. The city was saved, at least temporarily. Stalin sent triumphant telegrams to Moscow claiming victory. Trotsky was not mollified. On October 4, he had already sent an urgent telegram to Lenin: "I must insist on Stalin's dismissal. Things at the front near Tsaritsyn are going badly, despite an abundance of troops." Lenin finally sided with Trotsky. On October 19, 1918, Stalin was recalled to Moscow. He left Tsaritsyn after the siege was lifted, having been present during the defense, but recalled due to insubordination before the campaign was complete. The battles for Tsaritsyn weren't over. In January-February 1919, Krasnov besieged the city again. In June 1919, General Denikin's volunteer army successfully captured Tsaritsyn, and the Whites held it until early 1920. The city changed hands multiple times before finally being secured by Bolshevik forces in January 1920. Stalin wasn't present for any of these later engagements. His actual role in Tsaritsyn's defense lasted only from June to November 1918, about 5 months, during which the city successfully repelled 2 sieges, but during which Stalin's main contribution was political conflict with other Bolshevik leaders and the purge of military specialists.
The transformation of Stalin's role at Tsaritsyn from controversial commissar to heroic defender began almost immediately, but accelerated dramatically in the 1920s and 1930s as Stalin consolidated power. The renaming of Tsaritsyn to Stalingrad in 1925 was the first major propaganda victory. The city had been successfully defended in 1918-1920, and Stalin had been present during part of that defense. By renaming it after himself, Stalin associated his personal brand with military success and revolutionary defense, even though his actual role had been limited and contested. Throughout the 1920s, as Stalin maneuvered for power following Lenin's death in 1924, the Tsaritsyn narrative became increasingly important. Stalin's main rival was Trotsky, the very man who had demanded Stalin's recall from Tsaritsyn in 1918. By promoting the narrative that Stalin had heroically defended Tsaritsyn while Trotsky's military specialists had failed, Stalin could undermine Trotsky's prestige as the architect of Red Army victory. The Stalin cult reached its full development in the 1930s. Soviet historiography was systematically rewritten to emphasize Stalin's role in every important Civil War victory. Tsaritsyn became the centerpiece of this narrative. The defense of Tsaritsyn was dubbed the Red Verdun, comparing it to the famous French defensive victory of World War I. Stalin was portrayed as the iron-willed commander who, against all odds and despite interference from incompetent superiors, saved the city and the revolution. Alexei Tolstoy's novel, Bread, used the Tsaritsyn defense as its backdrop, presenting a fictionalized account that emphasized Stalin's leadership. The novel portrayed the military specialists as incompetent or treacherous, validated Stalin's purges of officers, and presented his defiance of Trotsky as necessary for victory. The propaganda campaign reached its culmination in 1942 with the 2-part film The Defense of Tsaritsyn, directed by the Vasilyev brothers. The film explicitly enhanced Stalin's role, portraying him as the organizing genius of the defense. Mikhail Galawani, who specialized in playing Stalin in Soviet films, portrayed the leader as calm, wise, and militarily brilliant, a stark contrast to the historical record of conflict, insubordination, and controversial purges. The timing of the film's release is significant. It premiered in 1942 during World War II, while another battle for the same city, now called Stalingrad, was approaching. The Battle of Stalingrad, 1942-1943, would become the turning point of the Eastern Front. By releasing a film celebrating Stalin's earlier defense of the city, just as it was being defended again, Soviet propaganda linked Stalin personally to both victories, creating a narrative of Stalin as the eternal defender of this crucial position. Mitrofan Grekov's paintings of Tsaritsyn defense, showing Stalin calmly observing troops from trenches alongside Voroshilov, became iconic images reproduced in textbooks, posters, and museums. These images bore little resemblance to what had actually happened. Stalin had not been a frontline military commander directing tactical operations, but they established visual shorthand for Stalin's supposed military genius. The propaganda served multiple purposes. It legitimized Stalin's rule by presenting him as a successful military leader who had saved the revolution when others failed.
It retrospectively justified his purges of military officers in the 1930s by claiming he had correctly identified unreliable elements back in 1918. It established Stalin as Lenin's true comrade and collaborator, marginalizing rivals like Trotsky who were written out of approved narratives or portrayed negatively. Critically, the Tsaritsyn myth also established the pattern for how Stalin's role in other Civil War campaigns would be presented. Similar exaggerations and falsifications affected accounts of operations at Perm against Denikin and in the Polish-Soviet War. The methodology perfected with Tsaritsyn, minimize or erase others' contributions, emphasize Stalin's supposed brilliance, rewrite conflicts as validation of Stalin's judgment, was applied systematically across Soviet historiography.
What actually happened at Tsaritsyn, stripped of propaganda embellishment? The city was successfully defended during 1918 to 1919, though it fell briefly to white forces in mid-1919 before being recaptured in 1920. This success had multiple causes, none of which primarily involved Stalin's military acumen. First, Tsaritsyn's strategic location and fortifications favored defense. The city had rail connections, river access, local industrial capacity for ammunition production, and defensive positions that could be held by moderately competent forces. Second, the Red forces defending Tsaritsyn had numerical advantages during critical phases. When Zhloba's Steel Division reinforced the city, the Reds had roughly equivalent or superior numbers to the besieging Cossacks. Numbers don't guarantee victory, but they certainly help. Third, the Don Cossacks, under Krasnov, while formidable fighters, had strategic limitations. Krasnov struggled to convince Cossacks to fight far from their home territories. His forces were primarily concerned with defending and expanding the Don Cossack region, not with broader strategic objectives. This meant that when Tsaritsyn's defense proved costly, Cossack willingness to continue attacking diminished. Fourth, the broader strategic situation favored the Bolsheviks. By late 1918 and early 1919, the Bolsheviks were concentrating resources on the southern front, understanding Tsaritsyn's importance. Meanwhile, the various white forces remained poorly coordinated, with different commanders pursuing different objectives. Fifth, Voroshilov, despite his limitations as a military commander, showed confidence in organizing defensive operations. Commanders like Dmitry Zhloba and other field officers made tactical decisions that determined battle outcomes. The military specialists that Stalin purged might actually have improved defensive coordination had they been allowed to function. What about Stalin specifically? His documented contributions were primarily political and administrative, not military. He helped organize grain requisitioning, which was his original mission. Grain did flow north from Tsaritsyn, helping to alleviate the food crisis in Moscow and Petrograd. This was significant. He helped establish the North Caucasus Military District as an administrative structure, centralizing Bolshevik authority in the region. Administrative organization matters in warfare. He identified and removed individuals he suspected of disloyalty. Whether these suspicions were justified is debatable. Some of those arrested may indeed have been unreliable, but Stalin's purges were indiscriminate and counterproductive, removing competent officers along with any actual traitors. What Stalin demonstrably did not do, he did not develop military strategy for the defense. Tactical and operational decisions were made by field commanders. He did not directly command troops in combat. He was a political commissar, not a military commander, despite later propaganda showing him in military leadership roles. He did not save the city through personal intervention. The city was saved through collective efforts of thousands of soldiers and several capable commanders, with the most critical intervention being Zloba's relief force, which Stalin had encouraged but not commanded. Most significantly, Stalin's conflict with Trotsky and the Central Military Command likely hindered rather than helped the defense. The purge of military specialists created command confusion. The insubordination created dual command structures. The personal feuding between Stalin and Trotsky distracted leadership attention from military operations. A reasonable assessment would be that Tsaritsyn was successfully defended despite Stalin's presence, not because of it. He contributed to political organization and food supply, important tasks, but his interference in military matters and his purges of officers were counterproductive. This assessment, of course, could not be expressed in Stalin's Soviet Union. Historians who questioned the official narrative risked arrest. Archives that might reveal unflavoring details were restricted. Memoirs had to conform to approved narratives or couldn't be published.
The Battle of Tsaritsyn's real significance lies not in what actually happened in 1918, but in how Stalin used it to build his political mythology. The Tsaritsyn narrative established Stalin's credentials as a military leader, which was politically valuable. In a party and country that had recently fought and won a civil war, military prestige mattered. Stalin had limited genuine military experience, but by claiming credit for Tsaritsyn's defense, he acquired that prestige retroactively. The narrative also helped Stalin in his power struggle with Trotsky. Throughout the 1920s, as the succession struggle after Lenin's death intensified, Stalin used Tsaritsyn to argue that Trotsky's policies had been wrong and that Stalin's judgment had been vindicated. Trotsky had wanted Stalin removed from Tsaritsyn. Stalin had stayed, and the city was saved. Therefore, Stalin was right, and Trotsky was wrong. This logic was tendentious, but politically effective. The Tsaritsyn myth became a template for Stalin's later purges. If military specialists had been unreliable traitors in 1918, then the massive purges of Red Army officers in 1937 through 1938 was simply continuation of necessary vigilance. Stalin's execution of thousands of military officers on the eve of World War II, including many talented commanders, was partly justified through reference to Tsaritsyn. He had purged unreliable officers then and been proven right. He was purging them now for the same reason. This logic was catastrophic. The purges of the late 1930s devastated the Red Army's command structure, eliminating experienced officers and creating a climate of fear that stifled initiative. When Germany invaded in 1941, the Red Army was commanded largely by politically reliable but militarily inexperienced officers, and it showed in the disastrous initial Soviet defeats. The renaming of Tsaritsyn to Stalingrad had the unintended consequence of making the city even more symbolically important during World War II. When German forces advanced toward the city in 1942, capturing Stalingrad became a propaganda objective for Hitler's regime, while defending Stalingrad became a matter of Soviet prestige. The city's name made it a symbolic target beyond its genuine strategic value.
The Battle of Tsaritsyn matters less for what happened militarily than for what it reveals about how authoritarian regimes construct legitimizing narratives. First, the case demonstrates how historical events can be systematically rewritten for political purposes when a regime controls information. Stalin's actual role at Tsaritsyn was documented in contemporary telegrams, reports, and accounts from other participants. Much of this documentation survived. Yet Soviet propaganda successfully established a counter-narrative that dominated public understanding for decades. Control over education, media, archives, and publishing allowed factual history to be suppressed and replaced with politically useful fiction. Second, the Tsaritsyn myth shows how political conflicts get retrojected into historical narratives. The Stalin-Trotsky rivalry of the 1920s determined how the 1918 events were subsequently described. Stalin's political need to discredit Trotsky shaped how historians were required to interpret Tsaritsyn. The past was rewritten to serve present political struggles. This pattern, using historiography as a weapon in contemporary political conflicts, appears repeatedly in authoritarian systems. Third, the case illustrates how military mythology serves regime legitimacy. Stalin had seized power through political maneuvering within party structures, not through military leadership or revolutionary heroism. But in a state born from revolution and civil war, military prestige mattered. By claiming credit for Tsaritsyn and other Civil War victories, Stalin acquired legitimacy he hadn't earned through actual military command. The mythology filled a legitimacy deficit. Fifth, the case shows how propaganda compounds over time, creating layers of false narrative that become progressively harder to disentangle. The initial exaggerations about Stalin's role led to the 1925 renaming. The renaming established Stalin's association with the city. That association justified the 1937 novel and 1942 film. The novel and film reinforced public belief in the mythology. By 1942, the mythology was so established that it influenced how the actual Battle of Stalingrad was understood and thought. False history created real consequences. Finally, the Tsaritsyn narrative reveals how difficult historical truth can be to establish and maintain when political power opposes it. Historians during Stalin's era who knew the actual events couldn't publish accurate accounts without risking arrest. After Stalin's death, there was limited appetite for completely demolishing myths that millions believed. Even today, with archives accessible and scholarship free from state control, popular understanding of events like Tsaritsyn remains influenced by decades of propaganda. Once false narratives embed themselves in collective memory, dislodging them is extraordinarily difficult. The Battle of Tsaritsyn was a successful defense of a strategically important city during the Russian Civil War, achieved through collective efforts, with Stalin playing a controversial political role. Stalin's propaganda apparatus transformed it into a personal triumph that justified his rule and his purges. Understanding the gap between these two versions, between what happened and what people were told happened, is essential for understanding how authoritarian power operates.